Welcome to Fjook Enterprise. As always, I'm your host, Fjook, and with me today I have Becky Rose.
Hi.
I'm go- so as you already know, I'm going to be interviewing you about tabletop role-playing games. How did you get into tabletop role-playing games?
Well, for me, it goes back to when I was at school. I was a nerdy outsider, of course, as is the stereotype, and not wanting to break off from that stereotype. Uh, One of my school friends told me about this games club. So I went along to this club, and there was all sorts of stuff going on, and it was out the back of a youth centre in this kind of like room underneath it, sort of like a basement, but I guess because the youth centre was on a slope, it wasn't really a basement. Anyway, it was kind of a storeroom, as it were. It had a number of tables set up and a number of games, so I walked up to one, and it happened to be a game called Blood Bowl, which is like this orcs versus humans American football game. And so I kind of watched it going on, saw how it worked, and then they said, "Do you want to go?" And so I said, "Okay." And so I played a game, and I happened to win it. And that was my first night. So I didn't even do role playing on the first night at this club, but I had a good time, and I won my game. So I went back, and before too long, it ended up in a role playing game. And it kind of grew from there. A few years later, I was chairman of the club.
What systems have you played?
Oh, well, systems. I mean, so many. Go on, cat. I'm doing the cat owner's dab here. My cat wants to go out. There we go. So many. I mean, I don't even know what system my very first game was. I can't even remember that first game. I just remember the room it was in and some of the people. I've done so many systems right from the old school era. Obviously D&D, but Shadowrun, MERP. Uh, Gosh, the list is endless. Cyberpunk, Old Traveller, Staff. Is it Space Master? That's it. God, all the old school games, basically Vampire the Masquerade. I did a campaign of that where we played right through history from like 0 AD all the way through, and then what we'd do a little adventure, and then we'd swap GMs and move time forward a bit. And so we just went right through history, sort of all the major things that happened in history, and ended up in the future by the time that campaign ended. I mean, so many. I mean, even if you look at the modern games like Fate, I'm doing a Savage Worlds game at the moment. Just finished a Corporation campaign. I'm playing Call of Cthulhu at the minute as well. I mean, that's on its like what, 7th edition now. I've done various incarnations of that and various variants of it as well, because you've got like the steampunk stuff with Gaslight and obviously the classic Victorian era Call of Cthulhu. So yeah, a lot of different games, including some I've written myself.
So, how did you go from being a player to being a game master then?
Well, I think there's a. I think most people can be a games master. You just have to have a story in you. There's certainly, I've met a couple of players over the years who maybe didn't suit the games master role, but I think largely speaking, anyone or most players can be a games master. It's just a question of having a story. And if you're not sure how to put a story together, there's so many tools and resources on learning how to do it. I mean, I just kind of naturally fell into it because I played in some games. I thought, this is cool. I'll have a go, and so I ran one. And I'm sure my first adventures were terrible, but as I improved, hopefully the adventures got better. And then I think I got to a point where Kitty wants to come in. There we go. I think I got to a point where uh, there was this moment where I sort of thought, well, a lot of this story stuff, you could actually, it's kind of the same as writing a book. And so if I learn how to write books and like read up those kind of resources, maybe I could run better games. And so I started doing that. I started learning about the tropes of writing and being a good writer, and then using those techniques in games. And I think my games came a long way when I started doing that, because I started to understand concepts like the MacGuffin and the hero's journey. There's a guy called, he's dead now, famous author. I'm just trying to remember his name. Kurt Vonnegut, who came up with this concept of story arcs, but as a line of fortune over time. And he sort of drew these sort of shapes of stories and stuff. And so I keep all this kind of stuff in mind whilst I'm GMing, to try and create a better narrative for the players to interact and engage with.
So you've run a lot of gaming systems, as you mentioned. Are there any that you refuse to run?
I think there's some that have come too old now, that their mechanics are maybe a bit dated. I remember once at a convention, I played this game of GURPS. Now, I hadn't played GURPS before, and I know it has a lot of fans that like swear by it, so you can do anything with GURPS and it's amazing. But I turned up for this game at a convention, and I was given a printout of a 20-page spreadsheet as a character sheet. And then on top of that was like background notes on the character, like 5 or 6 pages of reading. And so I tried sort of trying to figure out who this character was from this essentially a folder for a character sheet. And it was just too overwhelming. And at the end of the game, the GM obviously was a huge fan of GURPS. He was trying to get everyone who took part in it to sort of play this game. And I can give you the spreadsheet. I've got it here on pen drives that you can take away. And I'm like, I don't want a 20-page spreadsheet. I want to play a role-playing game. So I think for me that spoiled GURPS. There's some others as well, like the Apocalypse World systems. There's this sort of core mechanic for Apocalypse World, and there's a bazillion different variants of games that use the Apocalypse World engine, and some of them are quite good, and I've had a lot of fun playing them. But I think the core mechanics actually aren't great, because there's this system in it. So to do an action, you roll 2d6. Now, when you roll 2 6-sided dice, your most common result, the modal result, is a 7. And in Apocalypse World, a 7 is what they call a partial success. And you need to get, I think it's 9 or 10 possibly for a complete success. And so you're looking for a +2 modifier, really, on when you do something. So what tends to happen in Apocalypse World games is people tend to pair up and do everything in pairs, because if you assist someone, you give them a +2 bonus. And that, for me, kind of destroys the narrative that you're trying to tell. Is this mechanical thing is forcing something on the narrative. So like, I do this and I'll help on that one, and so it kind of breaks the game. There are still some good Apocalypse World based games, but I think as systems go, I generally try to avoid it because of how the mechanics influence the meta of the story, which I don't think is good. I'd rather the story stands on its own merit.
So to switch gears, what systems do you enjoy running?
Well, my favourite, really, it starts with the question, like when I get a new campaign going to players, the first thing you do is like find out what they want. Do they want over the top? Do they want, over the top and funny, or do they want a serious fantasy, or do they want an investigative drama? And different systems suit different types of stories. And but there are certainly some systems that kind of stand out as my go-to. So if I want to do ridiculous and over the top, I will go to Corporation. So this is a cyberpunk setting set in the future where corporations own everything, and you play these cybernetically enhanced agents who enforce the will of the corporations. And it's a very ridiculous game because it's almost impossible to die. So you can have really over the top action. So having your players go through enemies that have bazookas isn't a problem in Corporation, because as long as no one cuts their head off, and even then you can get some glue and stick it back on as long as you're quick enough. It's fine. And as a game, that I just love the ridiculousness of it, and then it allows you to do some really, really crazy stuff. If I'm doing fantasy, it kind of depends on the group, because obviously D&D is a go-to really for any fantasy game, and that's great. But some groups have different dynamics, and so say if you've got a player that is dominating play, and a bit of what we call an alpha gamer, that they always speak up first and stuff like that. If I've got a player like that in a group, then D&D is not the system I would choose to use with that group, because it allows those dominant players to build the most powerful characters and then steal all the limelight. So when I've got a player like that, I'll pull out a system I wrote myself called After Forever After, which controls the limelight as part of the game's mechanics. It uses cards instead of dice, so it encourages like the wallflowers in the group, the people that don't like to speak up as much. But if they've got some good cards in their hand, it sort of encourages them to come forward, and it means the players that like to steal the limelight soon run out of cards. So, and I'd rather use a system like that with a group like that. But I think to a large extent, a lot of the role-playing systems out there, it's really just a choice of, do you want crunch or do you want pure narrative? And the right balance is probably somewhere in the middle of that, and it's just choosing whereabouts you are on that scale. But it can be kind of hard to play anything other than D&D with a new group, because everyone knows it, everyone's got the book. Whereas if you play anything else, odds are one person has the book, and it's the person who wants to play that game. So it can be tricky to play a non-D&D game sometimes. But of course, there's always Call of Cthulhu. That's another quite popular one.
So, with all your years and experience with different systems, do you have any common house rules?
Oh, definitely. So if you take a game like D&D as a prime example, D&D is fundamentally, there are two things that drive the success of a group. So the first is the action economy, and that's like the minutiae of what you're doing on each turn, which is kind of where it sort of suits those players that like to sort of build a character to achieve a certain game mechanic. But one of the other issues with D&D is you are fully recovered anytime you get a long rest. Now, I've always said that if you're doing any kind of quest or journey in D&D, most journeys aren't really measured in how many miles they are. They're measured in how many encounters there are. Because you can do 500 miles in the click of your fingers in a role-playing game. It's just, oh, you were there, you're now there. Okay, and then you move on. But if you really want to make it feel like a journey, you put stuff in on the way, some encounters in on the way. And so I always kind of joke that, every journey in Dungeons and Dragons is exactly 2 encounters in length. Because, 2 encounters gives you enough of a sort of feel of variety and stuff, but without dragging you down in encounters. So, but the problem with that is if you have a long rest every time you're traveling 500 miles, on day 4, there's an encounter. And then on day 12, there's an encounter. The players don't feel like they've gotten worn out from the journey, from the quest. And it's almost too easy to take that long rest, because in the book, it's just 8 hours of rest. And then everything's back to full. You've got all your spells, all your health. And where's the journey in that? So the house rule I have is you've got to have comfortable lodgings to achieve the benefit of a long rest, and you can't do that in the wild. If you're in tents or camps or whatever, you have a short rest, but you don't have the benefits of a long rest. Not until you get to a town and you pay a tavern owner some money or whatever and actually get a proper night's sleep. And I think that really helps with D&D in particular. But it kind of depends on the game as to what's needed, and some it's really down to the story. I was doing when I first got the 5th edition of D&D, I did this campaign where, because the particular group I was playing, that first game of that I played a 5th edition with, they were very much like a coordinated tactical unit type of group. So I decided to remove the healing spells because I knew what would happen. If you had a cleric in that group, they would have stood behind the line, not doing anything other than healing, while the tank took all the damage and the ranger dealt all the other. So, and I don't want that to happen with this group, and I know it's exactly what they'll default to. So I just removed healing magic from the world for our first game of 5th edition. But that was purely saying, right, this is the kind of game we want to have, and let's make the game suit that. And so, yeah, I'll happily change mechanics for each different adventure that I play just to make it fit what we're trying to do that bit better.
That makes a lot of sense. Are there any moments you would like to discuss of the players completely surprising you?
Well, that depends. Is this channel there was something that happened recently that very did surprise me, but it's kind of over 18.
Consider this your warning, people watching this.
Okay. So we were playing Corporation, and the bad guy, because Corporation is so over the top, and even though it's like 500-700 years in the future, whatever, the bad guys in this particular scene, because the players had gone to Australia and I was doing it all like Mad Max and stuff. So I decided the bad guy was Mel Gibson. And I kind of went overboard with making Mel Gibson a ridiculous caricature of himself. And when they very first encountered Mel Gibson himself, after sort of going through the gang, and he was in this town made out of portaloos welded together, because why not? And he was in a compromising position, with servants attending to him in parts of his body that I won't go into. One of the players picks up on this scene and goes, okay, so he's already in a compromising position. I want to get him on side. So he just decides to walk up to Mel Gibson and stroke the donkey. Doesn't say anything, doesn't... I was so caught off guard by this. What do you even do?
Fair enough.
So yeah, no, that was a thing that caught me completely by surprise.
Related to that, are there any moments of everything going to plan that is a fond memory?
That's a really tough question, because I think most stories go generally to plan, in the sense of you'll always find a way to, like, if you're running a narrative as a GM, you'll find a way to complete the hero's journey for every character and so on, because that's what you do. And when something waylays that plan, you come up with another narrative tool to get you back on target of that hero having that journey. Most games I think generally err towards things come together in the end somehow, and then you just hope you haven't left too many loose ends and plot holes by the time you get to the end. I think and I've definitely done games where I've forgotten a load of plot holes, because I have a tendency to go, oh, this is a really cool dramatic moment to end the campaign, so let's go overboard big time. And then I kind of end the session afterwards and I go, you know what, I really should have done 4 more sessions to close off that storyline that I'd completely forgotten about at the time. So I'm guilty of ending campaigns a bit too soon. But I think there was one where I was doing this campaign, and it was fantasy, it was D&D, and I'd had this this idea that I didn't want to give the players too much in the way of powerful weapons, like magic weapons and stuff, but I did want a plot MacGuffin for killing the final boss. So I had them build their own magic weapon to do it with, and what I did is that I got all of the Norse gods, and I basically had them to sort of do something with every Norse god in order to add what that Norse god represents into the weapon. And it just kind of came together nicely with Fenrir being the last of the Norse gods that they had to sort of deal with, and so like the wolf, as it were, and bringer of Ragnarok, and it just kind of, even though it wasn't really a Norse mythology campaign, the campaign itself the planet all got completely wrecked by the failure of the players in the campaign. And it was at the moment that Fenris is looking over the world. And I thought, you know what, that kind of works because it's sort of a Ragnarok-ish kind of thing just happened. I know Fenris didn't eat the world, but it just narratively, it just really kind of worked for me on a strange level.
As a last question, any advice to fellow game masters out there?
Yes, I think so. Because it's the thing I think bugs me the most, or I notice the absence of it the most, and I'm guilty of it too. And that is, it's so easy to go, to put in a combat encounter. And there's nothing wrong with combat encounters. But what I think most of us are guilty of is forgetting that during a combat encounter, if you don't put scenery in, then that is just dice rolling. You need to have the environment be part of every battle you have. And whether it's just a table between you and the guy that you're trying to hit, and you've not got a reach weapon, so you're just kind of moving around, or it could be there's some stairs to the side of a corridor, and so somebody's at halfway up the stairs and somebody's at the floor and somebody's on top. Just something in the environment, whether it's a physical thing, whether it's something the players can interact with, something they can pick up and throw. And quite often I've seen the case where a player might pick up, I don't know, a candelabra off a table and hit someone with it. But the GM will go, well, the candelabra isn't in the weapons table, so we'll just make that, I don't know, D4 -1 damage. And I think that's a terrible, terrible shame, because if you force players to always use their main weapon and the one they're best with, you're going to get the same things happen narratively over and over again. So if you've got a character that has a longsword, does, I don't know, D8 damage, is it more interesting to have the 200th longsword attack of the campaign, or is it more interesting for that player to pick up the candelabra and hit the monster over the head with it? So, and I would argue that, well, let's have that candelabra moment. So don't put things in the environment that aren't as good as just doing yet another dice roll attack. So if a player in my game picks up a candelabra on the table and hits a monster with it, great, you've knocked that monster out. Why not? It's better than, I roll the dice and I've hit and I've done 5 damage. It's like, because what does that add to the narrative? I would argue very little. So that's my advice, is put things in the environment. And if a player says that, I do remember this game once where arguably the GM had kind of over-described, and we'd kind of been playing for about an hour and a half before, as players, we were really kind of getting into doing things because everything had been over-described. And one of the players, is one of the very first actions in the game, I said, okay, I'd like to take, I forget exactly what it was, but it's something, I'd like to take a log out of the fireplace. And they're like, oh no. The GM goes, no, it's a small fireplace, so it's just got little twigs and stuff. I'm like, why not let them have the log? Why kill the action for that? If a player puts something in the environment through their description, that's fantastic. And if I didn't imagine it there, but I can imagine it, if I can adapt my imagination to fit what the player's describing, that's better, because at least now I'm being consistent with how they're seeing the world. And as a GM, I think that's a lot better than saying, no, it's actually a small fireplace, or it's got a grate covering, or whatever you do to block the action. Let them have it.
That is solid advice. As always, do the YouTube things, comment, subscribe, like the video, and I'll see you in the next video.
All right, thank you for having me on.
It was fun.